It was a typical Tuesday afternoon at Joe's Grill, a small family-owned restaurant nestled on the corner of a bustling street. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow through the windows, and the gentle hum of conversations filled the air. The sizzle of food cooking on the grill and the clatter of plates being placed on tables created a comforting, familiar soundtrack for Sarah. As usual, she wore her apron over a casual shirt and jeans, her brown hair pulled back into a messy ponytail that reflected the day's workload. She'd been working at Joe's Grill for almost 2 years now, ever since she moved to town to escape the chaos of city life. The quiet small-town atmosphere had been a welcome change, and she quickly became a fixture in the local community. Sarah had always been a people person, known for her friendly smile and easygoing nature. She knew every regular customer by name and had learned the preferences of nearly every person who walked through the door. Whether it was remembering that Mr. Hawkins liked his coffee black or ensuring that the Thompsons had their usual table by the window, she had a knack for making customers feel at home. Her rapport with the locals made her popular, and it didn't take long before she started receiving more shifts, becoming a vital part of the restaurant's charm. Today, like most others, was busy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Joe, the owner, was manning the grill, his deep voice carrying above the buzz of conversation. He had a rugged, weathered appearance, a result of decades spent working in the restaurant business. His deep-set eyes seemed to always have a knowing look, as if he could read people's minds. He and Sarah had become more than just boss and employee. They had developed a mutual respect over the years, with Joe always making sure to check in with Sarah after particularly busy shifts, asking how she was doing, both personally and professionally. As Sarah moved between tables, carrying plates of food, refilling drinks, and exchanging small pleasantries with customers, the atmosphere remained light and easy. But the normal rhythm of the restaurant was about to be broken, and neither Sarah or the rest of the customers had any idea what was coming. The door opened, and in walked a man Sarah had seen around town a few times. He was a tall man with a strong build, wearing a blue polo shirt and khaki pants. He had a confident, almost arrogant stride, and there was something about his presence that made people take notice. But it wasn't his size or his walk that caught Sarah's attention, it was the MAGA hat perched atop his head. The hat, emblazoned with the bold red letters, immediately signaled his political allegiance. She had seen people wearing those hats before in town, and, like many others, she had her opinions about it. It wasn't that she was necessarily opposed to differing views. She had grown up in a household where political debate was a common dinner table conversation. But this man, with his open display of political preference, was something else entirely. Sarah's stomach tightened as she watched him walk toward a booth by the window, his gaze scanning the room as if he owned the place. Her eyes flicked to his hat again, and a mix of discomfort and resentment rose in her chest. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that she was here to do a job, not to judge people. After all, this was a restaurant, and she had seen all kinds of customers walk in. People didn't always fit into neat little categories. But this felt different. This felt like a challenge. She swallowed her discomfort and approached his table. He didn't look up right away, so Sarah took a deep breath and put on her best professional smile. She greeted him as she would any other customer, her voice steady and friendly. "Hi there, welcome to Joe's Grill. Can I get you something to drink?" The man slowly raised his gaze to meet hers, and the corners of his mouth curled into a slight smirk. He seemed to study her for a moment before responding. "A glass of water will be fine for now." Sarah nodded, trying her best to maintain her composure, but she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. As she turned to walk away, she noticed a few customers glance up at the man, their eyes lingering on the hat. She could sense their discomfort as well, though no one said anything. It was as if they were all waiting for something to happen, some moment of confrontation that seemed inevitable. Her mind raced as she walked back toward the kitchen to grab his water. Should she just let it go? He was a paying customer, after all. But as she filled the glass, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This was more than just a man wearing a hat. There was something about his whole demeanor, his air of superiority, that made Sarah feel like she was being judged. And in that moment, she realized something: she was judging him, too. As she returned to his table with the glass of water, the words were already forming in her mind. It was one of those moments where everything feels like it's happening in slow motion. She approached him, setting the glass down on the table, her heart beating faster than usual. Her voice faltered for just a moment as she spoke. "I'm afraid I won't be able to serve you today." The words left her mouth before she could fully process them. It was out there now. She saw his eyes widen slightly in surprise, his brows furrowing as he tried to make sense of what she had just said. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and indignation. "I can't serve you today," Sarah repeated, her voice a little firmer now. She didn't know why. She said it. It wasn't company policy. In fact, she knew that Joe would have never condoned something like this. But she felt an overwhelming need to assert herself, to do something, anything, to make a stand. "It's just company policy." The man stared at her, seemingly caught off guard by the refusal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah stood there, waiting for him to either argue or leave, but the silence was unbearable. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her now, their gazes sharp and curious. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but with a note of frustration. "You do realize I've been coming here for years, right? I've never had any problems before." Sarah didn't know what to say. The words, company policy, still hung in the air, but they felt empty now. What had started as a simple moment of professional courtesy was quickly spiraling into something far more complicated. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, backing away from the table. "I just can't." As she turned to walk away, she saw Joe standing at the counter, watching the exchange. His eyes locked onto hers for a brief moment, and she felt her stomach twist with nerves. Was he going to intervene? Was he going to reprimand her? But to her surprise, Joe simply nodded, as though he understood. He didn't say anything. Sarah's heart pounded as she retreated to the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. What had just happened? Why had she done that? And what would happen next? The next few minutes were a blur. She went about her duties, refilling drinks and bringing out food, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the MAGA hat. She kept wondering if she had made the right choice, or if, in her discomfort and her rush to judge, she had just made a huge mistake. The door opened again, and Sarah looked up to see the man leaving, still wearing the hat, still with that air of confidence about him. He didn't say anything as he walked out, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, something inside her, and something inside the restaurant as well. But what happened next would change everything. She had no idea at that moment that her decision, her one moment of judgment, would set off a chain of events that would force her to confront not only her own beliefs but also the complicated relationship between personal values and professional obligations. As the hours passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something wrong. She stood in the back of the kitchen, wiping down counters, absent-mindedly staring at the dishes stacked in front of her. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had told the man with the MAGA hat that she couldn't serve him. The words echoed in her ears, each repetition making her feel more uncertain, more conflicted. She wasn't even sure why she had said it. Sure, she had been uncomfortable with the hat, with the political statement it represented, but had that really been enough to refuse service? Her thoughts were interrupted when Joe walked into the kitchen, his heavy footsteps making the floorboards creak under his weight. He was quiet, his face unreadable. Sarah stiffened as she saw him approach, her anxiety rising. This was it. He was going to reprimand her for what she'd done, and rightfully so. He was the owner, and she had crossed a line. But to her surprise, Joe didn't say anything right away. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest as he surveyed the kitchen. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Sarah braced herself for whatever was coming, but what happened next took her completely off guard. "You know," Joe began, his voice low, "there are things that happen in this world that make us uncomfortable. People we don't agree with, opinions we don't share. But it's not our place to take those feelings out on others, especially not when they're here to support this business. Every person who walks through that door is a customer, and that's how we have to see them." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Joe held up a hand, silencing her before she could say anything. His expression was serious, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He wasn't angry, but there was an unmistakable sense of disappointment in his gaze. "I get it," Joe continued. "You don't like what that hat stands for, and you've got every right to feel that way. Hell, I've had my own fair share of disagreements with people in this town. But when you're behind that counter, behind this apron," he said, tapping the fabric of her shirt, "you have a job to do. And that job isn't about making political statements. It's about treating every person with the same level of respect, whether you agree with them or not." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened to his words. She hadn't considered it that way. She hadn't thought about how her actions could affect the business, the people who worked there, or even the other customers. Her emotions had taken over, and now she was paying the price. "But Joe," she began, trying to explain herself, "he was wearing that hat, and I know what you're thinking," Joe interrupted, his tone softening just a little. "And I understand why you felt the way you did. But you've got to find a way to separate your feelings from your work. You can't let one person's actions change how you do your job." Sarah bit her lip, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew Joe was right. She had let her personal beliefs cloud her judgment, and it was a mistake she'd have to live with. Joe continued, his voice quieter now. "This isn't just about you or me. This is about the restaurant. This place, Joe's Grill, it's been around for years. It's part of the community. And no matter what, we have to stay neutral. We can't afford to alienate anyone. Especially in a town like this." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. She had always thought of Joe's Grill as a family, a place where everyone could come together over a plate of hot food and a cold drink. But now, it seemed like there was a much bigger responsibility on her shoulders than she had realized. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joe nodded, his eyes softening. "I know you do. But don't ever let personal feelings get in the way of doing your job. People come in here for one reason, to eat. And we're here to provide that. Everything else can wait." Sarah nodded, though she still felt a pang of guilt in her chest. She had acted impulsively, letting her emotions guide her decisions. She had taken something that was supposed to be a professional situation and turned it into something personal. And now, she was paying the price. That night, after the last customers had left and the kitchen was finally quiet, Sarah sat down at one of the empty booths, her mind still spinning. She replayed the events of the day over and over again, trying to make sense of them. She knew she had made a mistake, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel like something bigger had been set into motion. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. She looked up, surprised to see the man in the MAGA hat standing in the doorway. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up, unsure of what to do. Had he come back to yell at her? To demand an apology? But when the man spoke, his voice was calm, even measured. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his gaze steady as he locked eyes with her. "For earlier. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. You were just doing your job." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the unexpected apology. She had been bracing for confrontation, but this was the last thing she expected. I don't agree with your politics, and I get why you were upset with me, he continued, but I shouldn't have taken it out on you. I've been coming to this place for a while, and I really like the food here. I didn't want to cause any trouble. For a moment, Sarah was speechless. She had been so sure that he would lash out, that he would accuse her of being unfair, of being prejudiced. But instead, he was offering an apology. The tension that had been building in her chest slowly began to dissipate as she processed his words. I'm sorry, too, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have said what I did. I let my personal feelings get in the way of my job. That wasn't right. The man nodded, his eyes softening. We all make mistakes, he said. I guess that's part of being human. They stood there in the quiet restaurant for a long moment, neither of them knowing exactly what to say next. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a shared recognition that they had both overstepped in different ways. I guess we're even now, the man said with a small smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I won't hold it against you if you don't hold it against me. Sarah smiled back, the weight in her chest finally beginning to lift. I won't, she said softly. As the man turned to leave, Sarah watched him go, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened. She wasn't sure what had changed, whether it was the man's apology or her own realization that her actions had consequences, but she knew that she had learned something valuable. In that moment, she understood that every decision, every action, rippled outward, affecting more than just herself. And in a world that often seemed divided by politics and opinions, it was the small moments of understanding, the willingness to admit mistakes, that made all the difference. As she cleaned up the last of the dishes, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she continue to feel uncomfortable in these situations, or would she find a way to move past them? And more importantly, how would this experience change the way she approached the people she encountered every day? One thing was certain, she wouldn't be the same person who had stood behind the counter earlier that day, ready to judge someone based on a simple piece of clothing. Life had a way of humbling you, making you question your assumptions, and forcing you to grow. And for Sarah, that lesson was just beginning. The following days felt like a blur to Sarah. She went through the motions of her job at Joe's Grill, greeting customers, taking orders, and serving food, but her mind was always preoccupied. The events of that fateful day kept resurfacing, how she had turned away a customer based on his political beliefs and how that had spiraled into something much bigger than she had anticipated. Every time she glanced over at the table where the man in the MAGA hat had sat, she felt a pang of discomfort, but also something else. Was it guilt? Or was it a deeper sense of reflection on how fragile the line between personal beliefs and professionalism could be? Though she had made amends with him, a sense of unease lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd done the right thing by refusing him service, even if her actions had been fueled by emotions rather than logic. The truth was, Sarah had always prided herself on being a strong woman who stood up for what she believed in. But now, she felt conflicted. Was standing firm in her convictions worth alienating others, even when those others were her customers, her livelihood? She didn't have the answer, but she knew that the man's return had sparked something within her, something that couldn't be easily ignored. A week later, Sarah was on shift again when she noticed a familiar face entering the restaurant. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the man in the MAGA hat walk through the door. This time, though, he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him, a petite woman with dark hair and a confident posture. They sat at the same table he had been at last time, the one by the window, and she found herself frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over, forcing a smile onto her face despite the tight knot in her stomach. "Hi, welcome back. What can I get for you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man looked up at her, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Sarah couldn't quite place. He didn't seem angry anymore, but there was a certain wariness to his expression. Same as before, he said gruffly. And this is my wife, Karen. He gestured to the woman beside him, who nodded politely but didn't say anything right away. Sarah hesitated, but then smiled again. It's nice to meet you, Karen, she said. I'll be right back with your drinks. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than she was seeing. Had the man brought his wife as some kind of statement? Or perhaps he had come back to test her, to see if she would treat him the same way as before? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making her feel as though she were walking on a tightrope. But she pushed the thoughts aside. She had a job to do. And this was just another customer, just another table to serve. Still, the unease didn't go away. As Sarah went about her duties, she watched from the corner of her eye as the couple sat in silence, reading over the menu. Occasionally, they exchanged quiet words, but otherwise, there was an almost palpable tension in the air. Sarah couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation. So, what do you think? The man asked, his voice low. I don't know, Karen replied. I thought we were past all this. But I can't ignore what happened last time. It just feels off, you know. Sarah's ears perked up as she overheard this exchange. Was Karen referring to her? Did the man's wife still harbor some negative feelings about what had happened before? Before she could ponder further, Sarah returned to their table with their drinks, setting the glasses down in front of them with a smile. Here you go, she said, trying to keep her tone light. Can I get you started on your food order? For a brief moment, there was silence as the couple exchanged a glance. It was subtle, but Sarah noticed it, the exchange of looks, the shared understanding between them. She felt as though she were intruding on something private, something that she wasn't supposed to know. Finally, the man spoke. Actually, there's something I'd like to talk to you about, he said, his tone a little more serious than before. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her nerves spiking again. What's on your mind? She asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though she could feel her heart racing in her chest. I just wanted to clear the air, the man began, his voice measured. I understand why you felt the way you did when I came in last time. But I also want you to know that I'm not the enemy. I'm just a guy who believes in what I believe. You don't have to agree with me, but I don't want you to treat me like I'm some kind of villain. I don't deserve that. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She had never thought of him as a villain. She had only seen him through the lens of her own political discomfort, her own biases. But hearing him speak this way made her realize just how much her own assumptions had shaped her actions. She had assumed he was part of a political movement she disagreed with, and in doing so, she had put him into a category that wasn't fair to him as an individual. I didn't mean to treat you like that, Sarah said, her voice softening. I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you based on your hat. Karen, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke. I appreciate you saying that, she said, her voice kind but firm. I know it's hard to see beyond the surface sometimes, but we all have our own reasons for the things we believe in. That doesn't make us bad people. Sarah nodded slowly, her thoughts whirling. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, one she hadn't anticipated. She had expected anger or resentment, but instead, she was met with understanding. The man and his wife weren't trying to make a political point, they were simply trying to be seen for who they were as individuals, not just as representatives of a political ideology. As the rest of the meal went on, the conversation lightened, and Sarah felt herself starting to relax. They talked about their favorite foods, the weather, and even shared a few jokes. By the time Sarah delivered the check, there was no tension left in the air. The man smiled at her, a genuine, unguarded smile. Thank you for your patience, he said. I know I came in here the wrong way last time. I hope we can start over. Sarah smiled back, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Of course, she said. I'm glad we could talk." As the couple left the restaurant, Sarah watched them go, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. In the span of a few short days, she had gone from refusing service to sharing a meaningful conversation with people she had once thought were so different from her. It was a reminder that, sometimes, the things that divided them could also bring them closer together, if they were willing to listen. But the experience didn't end there. As she went about her shifts in the days that followed, Sarah began to notice something subtle yet significant. More customers, some of them wearing political symbols or sporting opinions that didn't align with hers, were coming in. And instead of feeling anger or frustration, she felt a growing sense of curiosity. She wanted to understand them, not just judge them based on surface-level assumptions. Jo had been right all along. Her job wasn't just to serve food, it was to serve people, all people, regardless of their beliefs. And it wasn't about agreeing with them, it was about offering respect, understanding, and patience. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. In the end, Sarah had learned that sometimes, the greatest divide wasn't between left and right, but between people who were willing to listen and those who weren't. And it was up to her to choose which side she wanted to be on. The weeks that followed Sarah's conversation with the man in the MAGA hat seemed to change her outlook on everything. She noticed herself engaging in more conversations with customers, not just about their orders but about their lives. The walls she had once built to shield herself from uncomfortable topics seemed to crumble, and she found herself listening to people more openly. The small moments of connection, laughs shared over a joke, a word of encouragement given to a nervous customer, or the quiet exchange of experiences, began to feel more meaningful than the rush of orders and the clink of glasses that had once dominated her days. But not everyone was as forgiving as she had been. Sarah could sense the tension brewing in the restaurant, especially among her co-workers. She had always kept to herself, focused on her job, but now she found herself caught in the middle of whispered conversations. People started talking. Some of them supported her decision to stand up for her beliefs, while others questioned her judgment. The more time went on, the more she realized that her actions had far-reaching consequences that affected not only her but also those around her. One afternoon, while Sarah was taking orders during the lunch rush, she overheard two of her co-workers, Jenna and Alex, arguing quietly by the kitchen door. Their voices were hushed, but the tension in the air was thick. Jenna, a server who had worked at Joe's Grill for years, was known for her sharp opinions and fiery personality. She had always been outspoken about politics, and Sarah knew she leaned heavily toward one side of the political spectrum. Alex, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. He was younger, and while he didn't often voice his opinions, Sarah had always sensed he was more moderate in his views. "I can't believe she did that," Jenna said, her voice rising slightly. "Refusing service to a paying customer because of a damn hat? That's not just bad business, it's wrong. What happened to customer service?" "I get where you're coming from," Alex replied, his voice calm but firm. "But maybe she was just trying to stand up for something she believes in. It's not black and white, Jenna." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she listened in. She hadn't meant for any of this to turn into such a big deal, but now it seemed like her actions had become the topic of conversation, the catalyst for deeper issues that had been simmering beneath the surface. Jenna had always been vocal about her beliefs, but hearing her speak like this made Sarah realize just how divided people could be. Everyone seemed to have their own interpretation of right and wrong, and it wasn't always easy to reconcile those differences. As the shift continued, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had done what she thought was right, but now, she was seeing the ripple effects of her decision. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her co-workers, her customers, and the community she was a part of. She was realizing that her actions had sparked a much larger conversation, one that wasn't going to be resolved overnight. The next day, things took an unexpected turn when the man in the MAGA hat returned to Joe's Grill. This time, he was alone, and he sat at a different table. Sarah's stomach tightened as she saw him walk through the door, but she quickly composed herself. She knew she had to face the situation head-on, no matter how awkward it might be. As she approached his table, she tried to mask the apprehension in her voice. "Hey, welcome back. How can I help you today?" The man looked up at her with a familiar, almost calculated expression. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something else, something that made Sarah uneasy. "I'll take the usual," he said, and there was a slight edge to his voice that made her pause. "But I wanted to talk to you." Sarah nodded, doing her best to keep the tension from creeping into her own demeanor. "Of course. I'll be right back with your drink." She returned to the kitchen to grab his drink, and as she filled the glass, her mind raced. What did he want to talk about? Had he come back to accuse her of something? Or was he looking for an apology? She wasn't sure what to expect, but the knot in her stomach grew tighter with every passing second. When she returned to his table with the drink, the man gestured for her to sit down. Sarah hesitated for a moment but then complied, sitting across from him. She wasn't sure why, but something in his demeanor made her feel like this conversation was inevitable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man began, his voice steady but serious. "But I want you to understand something." He paused, looking her directly in the eyes. "What happened last time, it wasn't just about a hat. It was about respect. I felt disrespected, and I know you probably didn't mean it that way. But what you did hurt, and I want you to know that." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had never thought about it from his perspective, not really. She had been so focused on her own beliefs and emotions that she hadn't considered how her actions might have affected him personally. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that what she had done hadn't just been a minor misstep. It had been a moment of judgment that could have lasting consequences. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. "I didn't think about how it would come across. I was reacting to the hat, to what it represented, and I didn't stop to consider that you're just a person, someone who deserves respect." The man nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's all about respect," he said. "We might not agree on everything, but if we can respect each other, we can have a conversation. That's what I'm looking for. And I think that's what everyone's looking for." Sarah's heart felt lighter as she listened to him speak. This wasn't about politics. This was about humanity, about treating others with dignity and understanding, even when there were fundamental differences. It was about breaking down the walls that divided people and finding common ground, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. As they continued talking, Sarah realized something important: she wasn't alone in her struggle to navigate a world that often seemed divided. The man, despite his outward appearance and beliefs, was also trying to make sense of it all. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But maybe, just maybe, they could both learn from each other and make the world a little more understanding. When the conversation finally came to an end, Sarah felt a sense of closure, a sense that something had shifted. The man paid his bill, smiled at her, and left the restaurant without any bitterness. It was a small gesture, but it was one that spoke volumes. In that moment, Sarah realized that her actions, no matter how small they seemed, had the power to create change. As the days passed, things began to settle at Joe's Grill. The conversations among her co-workers became less charged, and there was a growing sense of understanding in the air. People didn't always agree, but they started to talk more openly, without fear of judgment. Sarah had unknowingly sparked a conversation that reached beyond the walls of the restaurant, and it was a conversation that would continue long after the man in the MAGA hat had left. And in the end, Sarah had learned that it wasn't just about making a decision in the heat of the moment. It was about being open to growth, about realizing that every encounter, every conversation, was an opportunity to learn something new, not just about others, but about herself. The impact of that day rippled through her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about politics or social divides, it was about human connection. It was about being willing to step outside of one's own bubble and see the world through someone else's eyes. And in doing so, Sarah discovered something that went far beyond the surface, an understanding that, despite the differences, there was more that united people than divided them. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself living in a haze of uncertainty and reflection. Her interaction with the man in the MAGA hat had been both humbling and transformative. The weight of their conversation lingered in her thoughts as she navigated through the mundane tasks of her daily life. She had spent years in the restaurant business, serving food, taking orders, smiling at customers, but nothing had ever felt quite as significant as this one conversation. She had entered the exchange hoping to defend her position, to assert her right to stand by her beliefs, but had left with something far more valuable, understanding. But as with any change in perspective, the aftermath was rarely easy to navigate. The walls she had built between herself and the customers, between her own beliefs and the beliefs of others, were now gone. Yet, the deeper she delved into this new approach, the more she realized just how difficult it was to remain open. Her mind had expanded, but the discomfort she felt in trying to understand the other side had only intensified. At work, the shifts in the atmosphere were palpable. Conversations had changed. Some of her coworkers seemed to walk on eggshells around her, unsure of how to address the situation. Jenna, in particular, appeared more distant, her sharp comments tempered with a reserved caution. Sarah couldn't blame her. Jenna had always been vocal in her opinions, but after the incident, there was a new level of restraint in her behavior. Whether it was respect or simply the uncertainty of where Sarah stood, it was hard to tell. Alex, on the other hand, was more supportive than ever. He'd been one of the few who had quietly defended her choice, not out of agreement, but out of respect for her ability to stand up for her beliefs. He was careful to avoid discussions that could become politically charged, but when Sarah caught him offering small acts of kindness, like taking over her section during a particularly busy rush or offering a listening ear when she was tired, it became clear that he understood something deeper about what had transpired. It wasn't about the politics or the hat, it was about the ability to engage with people beyond labels. Still, the weight of the situation began to show in small but telling ways. The incident with the MAGA man was now an unspoken presence in the restaurant, a conversation starter for many but a topic avoided by most. Whenever new customers came in, Sarah couldn't help but wonder whether they were aware of what had happened. Were they judging her based on a single decision? Were they questioning her professionalism, her ability to do her job? One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing behind the counter, absent-mindedly wiping down menus, when the doorbell above the entrance chimed. She looked up to find a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in a few weeks. The man in the MAGA hat had returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman, his wife, Sarah guessed, who was dressed in a smart, professional outfit. They walked in together with an air of quiet confidence, their movements calm and deliberate. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as they approached the counter. The familiar unease settled in her chest. "Hey, welcome back," she said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. She didn't know what to expect from him now, whether this would be an awkward encounter or something deeper. "Thanks," the man replied, his voice warmer than it had been the first time they'd spoken. "I wanted to come by and apologize for the way things went down last time. My wife and I were talking, and we thought maybe we could make it right." Sarah froze, unsure how to react. Apologize? She wasn't sure if she was supposed to accept it or question it. The emotions she had felt during their last conversation had been heavy, laden with a sense of self-righteousness. But now, hearing the apology, she realized just how much she had been holding on to, resentment, guilt, pride, all wrapped up in that one moment. Was it possible to move past it? To see it as an opportunity for growth, rather than a final verdict? "Thank you," Sarah said softly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "I really appreciate that." They settled into a booth, and as Sarah took their orders, she couldn't help but watch them from across the room. She was aware of the reactions of the other staff members. Jenna, who had been serving a table nearby, shot her a brief look of confusion, then shook her head. Alex, however, seemed to notice the change in atmosphere too. When he caught Sarah's eye, he smiled in that quiet, knowing way of his, and gave her a thumbs up. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, but the encounter stayed with Sarah, turning over and over in her mind. As she cleaned up after the rush, her thoughts kept circling back to the man and his wife. She had thought that once the incident with the MAGA hat had blown over, things would return to normal. But now, she realized that normal was an elusive concept. The world had changed in ways that she hadn't fully understood before. That night, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the last few weeks over and over. The way people had reacted, her co-workers, the man, even herself, was more complex than she had anticipated. There was no clear answer to the question of whether she had done the right thing. She had acted in the heat of the moment, and the consequences had reverberated through her life in ways she hadn't expected. But the deeper truth, she realized, was that there was no one-size-fits-all solution to the problems they had faced. It wasn't just about the MAGA hat, the man's beliefs, or even her own response. It was about something bigger, about understanding, about forgiveness, and about the shared human experience. Sarah's thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. How many others had encountered similar crossroads, moments where their beliefs and actions had collided with those of others? How many people had faced difficult choices and wished for a second chance, a moment to do it differently? The restaurant, once just a place to make a living, had become a microcosm of the world. And in that small space, she had witnessed how quickly things could escalate, how easily misunderstandings could take root, and how the power of a single conversation could change everything. When she finally fell asleep, Sarah did so with a sense of peace that had eluded her for weeks. She wasn't sure what the future held or whether the lessons she had learned would stay with her for the long term. But for the first time in a while, she felt that she was truly moving forward. And maybe that was enough. The days passed, and the world outside Joe's Grill continued to turn, but Sarah had changed. She had learned that life wasn't about being right, it was about understanding, about connecting, about finding common ground. And perhaps, in time, others would learn the same. Until then, Sarah was content to be a part of that change, however small her role might have seemed. In her own way, she had become an example of something bigger, a reminder that even in the most divided moments, there could be room for growth, for conversation, and for change. And maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen. As weeks turned into months, Sarah continued to grapple with the emotional and psychological aftermath of the incident at Joe's Grill. The entire experience had fundamentally altered her perception of both her job and the world around her. What had begun as a single, volatile interaction had blossomed into something far more profound. She realized, in the quiet moments of reflection, that the challenge wasn't simply to defend or reject differing viewpoints. The true test was how to navigate the discomfort of the unknown, how to allow room for growth in the face of confusion and division. She had witnessed firsthand how a seemingly simple incident could stir up so much tension, anger, frustration. But also, perhaps more importantly, understanding. The relationship she had once seen in terms of clear black and white divisions now seemed far more complicated. It was no longer just about political labels or the MAGA hat. It was about the shared humanity beneath those labels, something she hadn't truly considered until that day when she stood behind the counter at Joe's Grill, facing a man who wore the symbols of a belief system she didn't agree with. As the weeks went by, the restaurant returned to something resembling normalcy. The man in the MAGA hat had returned a few more times with his wife, each time more respectful and understanding than before. Sarah couldn't help but feel that they had both learned something important from their previous encounter. She, in turn, had begun to treat him with a different kind of respect, a respect not born of agreement but of shared human experience. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when she wanted to retreat into the safety of her own convictions. But the realization that growth often came from uncomfortable places kept her moving forward. One afternoon, while the sun dipped low in the sky and cast a soft, golden light across the worn wooden tables of the restaurant, Sarah found herself sitting with Alex. They hadn't spoken much about the incident, but something in his demeanor told her he had been just as affected as she had. He had always been a calm and steady presence, but in the wake of the incident, there was a new layer of depth to him, a quiet awareness that suggested he had been thinking deeply about the nature of the world they were all navigating. "Do you ever wonder if any of it really matters?" Sarah asked him, her voice almost a whisper as she stared out the window. The restaurant was quiet for the moment, save for the clink of silverware and the murmur of distant conversations. "Of course, I do," Alex said, his voice equally soft but filled with a quiet conviction. "I think about it every day. How we treat each other, how we see each other, it matters more than anything else. But it's hard, Sarah. It's so easy to just fall into our own circles, into our own ideas of right and wrong. It takes real effort to see people as they are, without letting labels and judgments get in the way." Sarah turned to look at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. It was the kind of conversation that only came after a real shift in perspective, and she knew he was right. It wasn't enough to simply say the words, it took active participation to create the change they wanted to see. And that change had to start somewhere, no matter how small it seemed. The restaurant, too, had begun to change in subtle ways. Conversations among the staff had grown more inclusive, more thoughtful. There was an underlying understanding that everyone, from the cooks to the waiters, had a voice and a story worth hearing. They had all experienced the shifting dynamics in the aftermath of that day. No longer could they ignore the complex and often uncomfortable nature of the world around them. The incident had forced them to face the realities of their community, of the country, of the fractured nature of society. But it also encouraged them to listen, to question their assumptions, and to grow. One evening, after the dinner rush, Sarah stood in the back office with Jenna, the coworker who had once seemed so distant in the wake of the incident. Jenna had always been outspoken, and after Sarah's decision to refuse service to the man with the MAGA hat, it had seemed as though she would never truly understand. Yet, over time, Sarah had come to appreciate Jenna's sharp perspective. And now, standing together, Sarah realized just how far they had both come in this journey of understanding. "I've been thinking about what you said that day," Jenna said, her tone quieter than usual. "About standing up for what we believe in. I didn't get it at the time, but now I do. It's not about agreeing with everything someone says. It's about not being afraid to have those hard conversations, even when they make us uncomfortable. Even when we don't have all the answers." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of Jenna's words settle over her. It was true, conversations about race, politics, and belief were rarely easy, but they were essential. If they didn't make the effort to engage, to understand, then the divide would only grow wider. She had seen firsthand how staying silent or avoiding difficult topics only created more misunderstanding. But when they had the courage to confront their differences, they had the chance to find common ground, to grow. Months passed, and Sarah's perspective continued to evolve. The restaurant remained a focal point of the community, a place where people came together not just to eat, but to connect. It was a microcosm of the world at large, filled with diverse individuals from all walks of life. But what Sarah realized, as she continued to work day in and day out, was that the restaurant had become more than just a place of business. It had become a sanctuary, a place where people could engage with each other in ways that extended beyond the politics of the day. It wasn't perfect, and there were still tensions that needed to be addressed, but there was now a shared understanding that they could get through it together. Then, one evening, a familiar face walked through the door. It was the man in the MAGA hat again, but this time he wasn't alone. He walked in with his son, who looked to be in his late teens. The young man wore a t-shirt that bore the emblem of a local high school sports team, and he had a nervous look on his face as he scanned the restaurant. Sarah recognized the man immediately and felt a flicker of anxiety in her chest. The last time they had spoken, there had been so much tension in the air. Would it be the same now? The man approached the counter, his eyes scanning the room, and when he met Sarah's gaze, he offered a polite smile. "Good evening," he said. Sarah hesitated for a moment before responding. "Good evening. What can I get for you today?" "Just a table for two," he said. "My son and I are meeting some friends here." The simplicity of the request seemed almost surreal. It was a small moment, but one that signified so much. No grand speeches, no ideological confrontations. Just two people coming together, in the same space, to share a meal. "I'll get you seated," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster than usual. As she led them to a booth, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. She had done it. She had managed to stand up for what she believed in, and in the end, she had made space for something greater: understanding, conversation, and the courage to keep moving forward. As she walked back to the counter, Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the man and his son. She realized that the world would continue to test them, continue to throw challenges in their way. But the important thing, she thought, was not to shy away from those tests. It was to face them head-on, with openness and empathy. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but she could contribute to that change, one conversation at a time. And perhaps, in the end, that was all anyone could really do, to continue evolving, learning, and embracing the discomfort of growth.